Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a very special guest back on the podcast, Dr. Matthew Stratton. He is, if you're not familiar with him, he was actually on an episode 62. We were just talking off air. That's been 2.5 years now. Early on in the podcast, here he was on. So if you're not familiar with him, he is an assistant professor of exercise science at the University of South Alabama. He received his PhD in exercise physiology from Texas Tech University, and he's also authored over 30 peer-reviewed articles and textbook chapters in the fields of nutrition, sports performance, and aging. And we're obviously going to dive into some of that. Dr. Matthew Stratton, welcome back on, man.
Thanks. Yeah, even though it's technically I've had the title for a year and a half now, something like that, it still feels weird sometimes.
Yeah, I bet, man. I bet. Yeah, it's probably going to take you a little bit of time here to get used to it. But like I said, you worked hard for that. I would be using that all the time if I could too.
Yeah, it is funny. I always say, like, with my students, like, I always start off the semester. I didn't get my degree for people to call me doctor or anything like that, so call me whatever you want. But then sometimes they'll say Mister, and there's that little part in the back of my head that's
you're like, doctor.
But I said you could say that, so it's fine.
I love it. Yep. No. That's probably how I would feel too. Since it's been 2.5 years, would love to get an update on what's going on in the last 2.5 years. You could do it. You can go over professionally, personally as well too. I'm sure people would be interested to hear both of those.
Yeah. So I know last time we talked, I was still doing my doctoral work out at Texas Tech, in the, as we like to call it, the energy balance and body composition laboratory, looking at all things. One of the ways I'll break it down to people is all the things that go into telling you how fat you are. And so all things body composition and different things that affect those tests, as well as a lot of supplement work and dietary work and stuff like that. And so finished up there in summer 2022. And then after graduated from there, since it's usually go to school to try to get a paycheck and eventually get a job. Got an actual job out here in Mobile, Alabama at the University of South Alabama. So I've been out here by the Bay for about 1.5 years now, keeping up with the same stuff there. Mostly liking to focus on a lot of similar supplement stuff. A big thing with mine is still intermittent fasting work. So still did some of more of that with my dissertation and hoping to do a lot of that in the future as well.
Awesome. Yeah, no, congrats on that. I know it's people I've had on here that have been working to get their PhD. I know it's not easy, and I know it takes a lot of work and a lot of time and probably a lot of stressful work as well too, to get it done. What was like because I'm not super, I don't know the exact process to get it, but like you usually have to do like a study and stuff like that, right? To finalize it. What is that true? Is that kind of what you have to do there in that process for the PhD or?
Yeah, so every school you go to is going to have the process be slightly different. Timelines will be slightly different, especially what they do for what they call comps, which is a big exam that you usually have to take before they let you start your dissertation, which is the kind of study that you have to run. But yeah, usually the final kind of like big capstone project is you run a big study and then write this 100-page document on it and all that kind of stuff. And then you put it in front of a group of professors and then they tell you like everything you did wrong. And no, usually like they want you to pass because it also looks good for them if they can say, look at all my students are amazing and they're passing and all that kind of stuff too. But that's once you finish that, you finish your dissertation, usually that's the final checkbox of, okay, cool. Now you can finally have those fancy 3 letters behind your name and walk across the stage, and we'll kick you out into the real world. So hopefully go do something.
What was yours on?
Yeah, so mine, that is going into a little bit of like where my interests in like intermittent fasting and stuff are going. Mine was looking at the effect of breakfast consumption on afternoon resistance training performance. One of the reasons I was really interested in that was because with intermittent fasting, the number one meal that most protocols will have you skip is breakfast. And when we looked at the literature, there wasn't really actually that much on whether or not breakfast consumption in and of itself impacted exercise once people start eating again. So there's a couple studies on whether or not eating before exercise affects it in the morning, whether or not you're doing fasted or fed exercise in the morning, but not really anything on whether or not people skip breakfast, but they still have lunch, maybe an afternoon snack, and then go train in the afternoon, like that type of thing. And the only couple studies that were out there like that were on cardio. Now, nothing against cardio, but it kills our gains. We got it. we got to look at how it affects lifting and stuff. So my dissertation was looking at, okay, is breakfast actually really that important if people are going to go lift in the afternoon?
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, that was actually one of the studies I had pulled up. And so that was okay. So that was the one that you had to do there. And I do want to dive into update on intermittent fasting, things like that. But since we're talking about it now, what was the findings there with that? And were you surprised by them and whatnot?
Yeah, so there were a couple things I was actually surprised about. So one little twist to that particular paper is, like I mentioned, there were a few papers that had done something similar with either cycling or rowing. And even there were the few papers that had looked at fasted versus fed exercise in the morning. All of them were done in people that normally ate breakfast. And so, and there's two particular papers, one in cycling and one in lifting, that showed that some of the performance decrements that those papers showed for when people exercise fasted in the morning were likely largely psychological. And so what they did is a kind of really interesting model where they gave them what they called in the paper a viscous placebo, which sounds oh so appetizing.
Yeah.
But it basically is a way to try to like mimic a placebo. So they weren't actually getting calories, but to make them think that they were eating. And that kind of got rid of any of the performance decrements they saw from performing the exercise fasted versus fed. And to try to also control for some of the psychological components of it, we also recruited equal amounts of people that normally ate breakfast and normally skipped breakfast. Because we didn't want to run into people thinking like, oh, I normally eat breakfast before I go lift in the afternoon. Since I haven't eaten breakfast, even though I've eaten the same amount of food going into it, like I'm going to perform worse just because I haven't eaten breakfast. So we got equal amounts of people that ate breakfast and equal amounts of people that didn't eat breakfast. And then basically we brought them into the lab, tested their squat, bench, and deadlift 1RM, and then gave them the same amount of food to eat and basically had them either split that food up between breakfast and lunch or eat all the same food just at lunch. And then come in and do a workout that was a squat, bench, dead, so an SBD day, using 80% of their 1RM for 4 sets. And the first 3 sets we had them take to an RIR of 1 or an RPE 9. They have 1 left in the tank, just in case listeners aren't necessarily familiar with RIR or RPE training. Essentially, we told everyone to do as many reps as you can and then stop whenever you feel like you only have 1 left. And then the final set of the 4, so they did that for the first 3, and the final set for the 4, they just took it all the way to failure. And we had them do that same thing for squat, had to do that same thing for bench, and the same thing for deadlift. And one of the other big reasons for that was, again, a lot of times, one of my gripes with a lot of the exercise literature, unfortunately, is we do a lot of workouts in studies that are, great for being in the lab because they're really easy to control and all this kind of stuff, but they're not necessarily super well representative of what you might find in the field. And the reason we're doing a lot of this stuff is to figure out how is it actually going to affect people's performance in the field. And so as a powerlifter myself and stuff, like I have a lot of friends that do SBD days and stuff like this. And so wanted something closer to that. And especially with the rise of like RIR and RPE and especially powerlifting training. And a lot of protocols also are things like the pre-workout study that you mentioned, where, what we did in that study was work people up to a 1RM and then drop them down to a multiple of their body weight and then just had them do a single set to failure and said, okay, cool. Like, how did caffeine affect that? That's not very well representative of how people train. And so most people are training, doing multiple sets, a couple sets, maybe close to failure, short of failure, that kind of thing. So we wanted a model that was a little bit more, fancy term we use, where ecologically valid is like when we want to sound smart. And interestingly, we didn't find a difference in performance between whether people had breakfast or not. So the main thing that I would say take away from that is, as long as you're eating the same amount of food before you go train, you can split it up however works best for you. So with a lot of those studies, people will see the null result and be like, oh, it was worthless. All this. The way I like to spin it is more, you just have more tools in your toolbox now. If you're working with somebody that really likes to have a couple meals before they go train, then great, have them do that. If you're working with somebody that wants to do something like intermittent fasting and then just wants to have that one really big meal, great, they can do that. And this shows they can do whichever works best for them and still have equal like workouts. Like their workout will still be equally effective. The one thing I thought was interesting is I thought we were going to, especially for some of the psychometric parameters and looking at what people preferred and stuff like that, I thought it would align a little bit more with what people normally did. So for instance, the people who normally skipped breakfast, they would prefer more of the like skipping breakfast condition. Yep. And the people that normally ate breakfast preferred breakfast condition. What actually happened though is majority of the people actually preferred the breakfast and lunch condition, even when they thought they had a better workout in the lunch only condition.
Interesting.
Yeah, because we on the last visit after they finished, we said, okay, which one did you feel like you had a better workout in, and which one do you prefer doing? And so it was pretty even on which one they felt they had a better workout in, but I'd have to go look exactly at the numbers again, but I believe it was about 3/4 of the participants prefer the breakfast and lunch. Now, my guess with that is mostly when you're doing a study, like for instance, that particular study where provide all the food and all that kind of stuff, you have to play a very tricky balancing game in that you need to give people enough food that when you split it up, they're not going to be like starving.
Yeah.
But when you put it all together, it's not so much food, it's vomit inducing.
Yep.
So I think part of it is, especially for some of the bigger, heavier guys, we had people that were squatting 600 pounds and stuff in it. And so for them, those guys, the lunch only condition was like so much food, and the food was all like really filling food that they were coming in going, yeah, I'm super, super full. So this isn't the most fun thing in the world.
Yeah. So go ahead.
And so I was going to say, like, that comes down again to like, how do you apply these settings where in this instance, showing as long as you eat the same amount of food, you should see the same results. But again, in the real world, eating the same amount of food may end up being closer to like breakfast, lunch, and like a pre-workout snack, and like a lunch and a slightly bigger pre-workout snack than actually breakfast and lunch and a really big lunch.
So yeah, that's super interesting. So really they had like, from a performance standpoint, they had better workout when they just had the large meal ahead of time. But you said more people enjoyed splitting it up, and you think it's probably just due to the fact that, again, you get so much. If you had to combine those two meals, that obviously was going to play a big impact there. And it could have just been like eating all that food at one time might have been too much for those people potentially on that from like how they felt about it.
Yeah. So that's in the people that reported that they liked the breakfast and lunch condition, even though they felt like they had a better workout in the lunch only condition, I'm pretty sure that's what was going on. And
yeah,
I know there were a couple people, like I said, that we had a couple really big dudes that were 240 ish, and then benching 400, squatting 600, stuff like that. Then so for the amount of food that we had to give them, because we were basing it, the amount of food we gave them was relative to their weight.
Okay. Yeah.
We split everybody into kind of like weight classes, and so every 10 kilogram weight class got a certain amount of food that we estimated to be about 40% of what we would normally recommend they intake in a day. And yeah, the heavy people got that lunch may have been like 12, I think it was like 1250-ish calories.
Man.
Yeah, versus some of our small females that were only 120 pounds or something like that. Even all of it together, their lunch, I think, was like 800 calories or something like that.
Gotcha. And so again, it sounds like the big thing there, it's like, it's just the amount of, again, overall intake, I guess, for the day, but also just like overall amount, like ahead of time is the most like important. I was going to ask you, so would it be, I forgot what my question was going to be. I had it this entire time. If you did split it up and you just had a smaller lunch, do you think that would make a difference, or were you not able to, like, where it's like, hey, you just have a smaller lunch? Do you think that would have altered things a little bit there on that?
Yeah, the only thing we would have, so the reason we did it our way is because we were trying to just isolate it so that the only difference was how many meals the person was having per day. There wasn't a potential contributing factor of the person. If the person performed worse on the lunch, it was because they ate less before they went in. Because some of the previous studies that had done something similar, one of the big discrepancies was people ended up eating a lot less before exercising. And they ate a lot less, so that was likely a contributing factor to them not performing as well. My hypothesis, again, because the study like this hasn't been done, this is just straight hypothesizing. But my best guess would be if the person had a smaller lunch, it probably wouldn't make that much of a difference if the person was doing like a typical lifting workout that a lot of gym bros do and stuff like that. Go in, maybe a quick pump session, stuff like that. I think the closer you get to doing true like all out max sessions, the more that's going to matter. But if it's a lighter session, it's probably not going to make that big of a difference, because again, the previous studies that showed a slight decrement, there was one even in cycling that they showed a slight decrement with cycling. But again, I'm guessing that was more psychological. But a couple of the other ones, they really only showed very slight decrements, and it was when people were doing like races.
Gotcha.
And so people were going all out max, like how fast, like for the rowing paper, I believe it was a 2-kilometer time trial. So basically like how fast can you finish 2 kilometers? And so when you're doing that, like all out max peak performance competition day type thing, then that's when I think those really tiny differences might matter. But for just a normal sub-maximal training session, like you're not maxing out, even if you're doing big compound lifts, you're maybe only doing 4 or 5 sets of stuff like that, then I think it's much less likely that it's going to really impact, as long as the difference isn't fully massive. Like you're not talking about, I don't know, 200 grams of carb difference or something like that going in, then I guess it might play a little bit of a role, but not too much. And the biggest thing that I think it might impact is more not necessarily even the amount of weight that you lift or the amount of reps that you get, but how hard you feel the session is. So
yeah,
if we ask you
the RPE.
Yeah. So if we ask you like session RPE, like you might get the same objective performance, but then the session might feel like a 7 instead of a 6 or something like that.
Kind of if you were like in a deficit or something like that, same type of thing compared to if you were in a surplus. Again, it may be impacted a little bit, but like how you feel in that session is probably going to be a lot harder when you're in that deficit than that RPE. And I think too, what you said there lines up with, I think there was a paper, I think it was by King, and they talked about carbohydrates before workout. And it seemed like it was very similar to what you just said there, where it's like, hey, the more volume you do, the bigger the muscle group, the higher the intensity of the workout is, like the more important it is to really get more carbohydrates and whatnot, like before the workout and stuff like that, before it starts to impact it there.
Yep.
Cool. No, that was a cool study. And I think, like you said there, really at the end of the day, it just gives us it gives you a little bit more flexibility. You're not like constrained, oh, I have to eat this at this time and whatnot. And you get a little bit of flexibility there with that, which is always nice to see. So I guess that obviously is in line with intermittent fasting. And so we had you on 2.5 years ago. We talked about it then. We had a deep dive into it. And so I wanted to see if there was any updates from that perspective on intermittent fasting. But before we do that, could you maybe just briefly go over maybe some terminology with intermittent fasting so people are on the same page there with that?
Yeah. I'll give you a brief rundown, unless you want to boost your listening numbers. So you have to go back and listen to the old one. If you want, you have to pause it now, go back, listen to the old one, and then come back. But yeah, so intermittent fasting, we use this term intermittent fasting a lot, but what it actually is a really broad blanket term that encompasses a multitude of different protocols. What most people think of when you say intermittent fasting is what's actually in the literature we call time restricted eating, or TRE. And if you look at older literature, say 2016 to probably pre-2016 to probably 2018-ish, you'll actually see, instead of TRE, TRF for time restricted feeding. They're essentially the same thing. It's just one thing that happens in science a lot is we just quibble over semantics. And so people were like, we're not feeding the people, like they're choosing to eat. So we're going to call it time restricted eating instead of time restricted feeding. So that's become now the new thing is TRE. And essentially, like I said, that's what most people, when you hear intermittent fasting, that's actually what we're talking about, is time restricted eating. It's these daily fasts that, even though they don't, to most people, 16, 18-hour fast is going to sound like a long fast, but in the intermittent fasting world, that's what we consider a short fast. So most common examples of that are going to be something like we call the 16 and 8 protocol, which means you put all of your food into an 8-hour window. So the first number in the protocol is always how long you're fasting. The second number is always how long you're eating. And so again, that's the most common one, is the 16 and 8, where say you only eat between noon and 8 p.m. or 1 and 9 p.m., something like that. I'd say the next most common one is probably the 20 and 4. So where same idea, except you only eat 4 hours a day. So fast 20 hours a day. So you may only eat between 4 p.m. and 8 p.m. And I know a lot of people, when you think about not eating outside of like noon to 8 p.m., it sounds like a lot. It's the old thing of tell you don't touch your face, and the first thing you want to do is touch your face. So if I tell you don't eat, like the first thing you want to do is eat. But if you really think about it, how different it is from what a lot of people like normally do, say you like wake up in the morning, you're running late. So instead of having breakfast, you just grab coffee on the way out the door or something, then you get to work, and then there's a bunch of stuff going on there. So then you get caught up, and then you might not eat until lunch. Guess what? You just essentially did the not eating until noon thing, and then just don't snack after 8 p.m. And that's intermittent fast. That's time restricted eating for most people. There are a bunch of other variants. When you look in the literature, actually the most common one is this thing called ADF, or alternate day fasting. That was the prominent one we saw in the literature up until about 2016, 2017. And that one, again, like I tell my students all the time, scientists, we're not original with what we call things. So alternate day fasting is literally fast one day, don't fast the other day. So you alternate days in which you're fasting. Then that kind of gave breath to a few other common ones. It was popular for a little bit, then it got out of vogue, and I started to see some more studies coming out with it again. It's this variant called 5-2, which is essentially it's very similar to alternate day fasting, except one of the reasons we went away from it and actually started to develop and more use things like time restricted eating is if I told my client, hey, guess what? You don't get to eat tomorrow. Most of them aren't going to have great compliance for very long. And so they came up with this thing called like modified alternate day fasting, which said, okay, we'll let you eat, but just a little bit around lunch. And so modified alternate day fasting is typically have a small meal, about 25 to 30% of normal daily calories. Let's say your maintenance calories are 2,000 calories a day. Now you're going to only eat 500 calories. And you're going to have that just for lunch and then fast the rest of the day. And what 5-2 is basically that, except you only, instead of every other day, you just only do that 2 non-consecutive days out of the week. So you pick, say, and like one of my general recommendations is if you're doing something like that is pick days that you're busier. And so let's say you're really busy on Monday from catching up at work from all the stuff that piled up over the weekend, and then really busy on Friday because you want to get rid of as much stuff. So then when you come in on Monday, you won't be as busy. So then let's say Monday and Friday, those are the days you're only going to have 500 calories, whatever. And then so that's 5-2, and that's come back in vogue a little bit. But I'd say those are the most prevailing ones, is that time restricted eating, your alternate day fasting, or 5-2, which falls under modified alternate day fasting, or sometimes what we call periodic fasting as well, which means you're not fasting every day. You're not fasting every other day. You just fast periodically.
Yeah, I think it's good to go over because a lot of people, they just kind of group fasting into one big thing. But as you just went through there's a lot of different kind of terminology and whatnot. One fast, like you said, you do an alternate day fasting or you do a 5-2. That's going to be a lot different than doing like a 18 or what was it, 16-8 protocol, right? Like time restricted feeding, eating, whatever you want to call it there on that. What would be, so again, the one that I commonly have clients like bring up to me is definitely the time restricted eating, feeding one, where it's, again, it's like a big chunk of the day. But as you mentioned too, it's you skip breakfast, you skip one meal, you're like already doing that without even labeling it. And then we sleep too. Obviously, that's for most people, that's 6 to 8 hours right there that you're already doing it. So it's like you already do it naturally. With some of these longer fasts, what would be, we go like alternate day fasting where you skip a whole day, maybe do a 5-2 protocol or even longer, which I do want to touch on that to see kind of your thoughts on that. But from a body composition standpoint, what would be like, what are your thoughts around that? Would you say that's probably suboptimal from a body composition standpoint? And yeah, what would be some downsides of doing those kind of longer ones like that?
The biggest thing we run into that we always have to think about is protein intake. And so I think one of the biggest things in the fasting literature now is now we have a good bit of data that the act of fasting in of itself isn't really doing that much to say like increasing weight loss or anything beyond essentially just tricking people into eating less. So and that's one of the reasons even though it might sound disappointing to some people to say, oh yeah, when you control for calories and people eat the same amount of calories and you go lift, and as long as you eat the same amount of calories, same amount of protein, you see the same changes in body composition. But I know that kind of is like a downer for a lot of people. But the reason, again, I like it is one that gives me more tools in my toolbox, because if that tells me that if someone doesn't want to do intermittent fasting, they don't have to. They can do something else that works for them. But if someone really likes doing intermittent fasting, great, they can. They're not like missing out. But what we have tons and tons of studies now showing is that when we tell people to follow these protocols, whether they're trying to or not, vast majority of the time they cut their calories. And there's a couple papers suggesting that on average with some of these calories, it's about 20%. We've got 1 or 2 papers saying that for most people, it ends up being about 5 to 550 calories per day is what the average person will cut their intake by. And so a lot of the spontaneous weight loss we see is, again, shocking. People just eat less and you lose weight. But the downside of that is that where people initially cut is protein intake. And especially when we're talking about weight loss and fasting and all this kind of stuff, we need to make sure we're maintaining muscle mass. And in order to maintain muscle mass, we need to make sure we're eating enough protein. And so the hardest thing to do with a lot of these is make sure to harp on that people are still getting enough protein in. And so when they are eating, kind of building it around protein. And then that kind of also ends up almost accelerating the weight loss, because protein is a very satiating, very filling macronutrient. So when people are eating a lot of protein, they want to eat less of all the other stuff. And if so, the very first thing when they do this is protein, they make sure they get their protein in, and then they're cutting their calories even more and they lose more weight, which is great. But that's one of the reasons why you hear all this. And this time, like, I started fasting and I lost all this weight, so fasting must do something magical. And we have a bunch of studies showing that the fasting group lost more weight than the non-fasting group. But then when you look at the studies and look at the data, it's 99% of the time, it's the group that was fasting was eating less calories. And especially with longer fasts and stuff like that, that's when again, we don't have data to necessarily say like these repeated 36-hour fasts and stuff like that are really going to be harmful and make you lose a lot of muscle and all that kind of stuff, because your body actually has some interesting protective mechanisms that kind of help spare protein in terms of fasting. And we have data suggesting that even up to potentially 36 hours, we don't really see too big of an uptick in muscle protein breakdown. That was from some data from our lab where we had people do a 24-hour fast and we didn't see an uptick in protein breakdown. But there was one at 36 hours. So if you're doing a normal alternate day fasting protocol, it's about a 36-hour fast on average. So like 8 p.m. one night to 8 a.m., 36 hours later. And so then you might run into some issues there. Most of the studies we have right now looking at potential effects of prolonged fasting or these longer than 24-hour fasts, and mostly acute, looking at, okay, how does glucose change? How does insulin change? How do ketone bodies change? How does fat oxidation change in these short fasts? I think partly just because just thinking from purely the researcher side, yeah, that's an interesting question, but trying to recruit 30, 40 people to be like, hey, come join my study where pretty regularly I'm going to say you can't eat for 2 days or something. Yep. That's going to take me a long time to find people that are dumb enough to sign up for my study. But so yeah, especially the only thing I'd really worry is just with muscle loss. And when in the short normal fast, like time restricted eating, and I'd say even up to sometimes what used to be called for a while whole day fasting, which is 24-hour fast, like once or twice a week. Some people also know it as eat, stop, eat is the protocol that kind of first popularized it from the book of Brad Pilon. And so for those, I think as long as you're getting enough protein in per day, you're completely fine. But when you start getting above that 24 to 36 hour mark, that's when you're not eating every single day and could start to potentially see or be at greater risk for muscle loss in the long term, because there's only so much muscle you can accrue each day.
Yeah.
And so how often you're doing that one long fast, like it might not show up for several months to several years, but I think you're making yourself at a much greater risk. And so and again, that is just complete mechanistic theorizing, just because again, all the data that we have right now on those type of stuff is just like a single acute fast. And a single acute doesn't necessarily always tell us what's going to happen in the long term, but it gives us a guess. So until I have data saying I'm wrong or I'm right, I just have to go off of the mechanistic guess.
Yeah. So just to sum that up. So it's like basically 24 hours, again, in these acute settings. So just so people know, this isn't like multiple weeks. So we don't know what would happen if you would do this for multiple weeks, correct? That's what it sounds like there. It's not, these aren't long-term studies that they've done on this.
Yeah. So it's like we haven't done. Now, I always have to preface with this just because I should say I'm not aware of any studies, right, because there's so many studies out there. And I can tell you how many times I've spent like weeks looking for a study and I'm just convinced there's not one. And then I'll talk to one of my friends and like, oh yeah, there's this one right here. I'm like, oh, geez.
Yeah, I can only imagine. There's so much out there.
Exactly. So I should just say, like, for all the literature that I'm aware of, I'm not aware of any long-term. Say if I had you do a 24 or 36 hour fast twice a week for 12 weeks or 6 months or something like that, how that would really impact changes in body composition aside from just getting you to eat less calories. So looking at muscle maintenance and stuff like that. We have some with the modified alternate day fasting, and we have a little bit, in alternate day fasting with that. But the one thing I don't necessarily count it within this is because in those groups, they're not exercising. And it's clinical populations that are sedentary and they're not exercising. And so when we're looking at especially how our field and stuff like that, and what we have come to learn whenever people are going through diet, and we want them to exercise in order to maintain muscle mass. So I don't think those are necessarily as representative as what we would want to extrapolate to people that are exercising. But yeah, so it's essentially just like we only have it if people in exercising populations, if people did one 24-hour fast and then did a workout or something like that. Any of the long-term stuff is just people not exercising or people that are really obese, and stuff works a little bit differently in those populations and stuff like that.
Like you said, too, it'd be really hard to find people that exercise, be like, hey, don't eat for 2 days or whatnot. Like you said, that's going to be a really hard thing to do. You're not going to find many people that are going to want to do that. And I think this is a good question. Also, even if we did lose a little bit, it's like, how much muscle can you actually lose like in that short amount of time? And then I'm assuming like once you do start eating again, maybe send that signal to build more muscle. Like I would imagine that probably comes back fairly quickly as well, too, right? Like if that were to happen, or again, probably just something that would be more of a hypothesis than anything there on that. And would the body fat levels probably also would impact this as well too, correct? Like current body fat levels.
Yeah. So we have pointed that a bunch of the different protective mechanisms and all that kind of stuff are very different in people that have higher body fat levels than people that have low body fat levels. And so higher body fat levels, people are actually a little bit more, they're less susceptible to some of the downsides of fasting and stuff like that. So because for some of the things like protein breakdown and all that kind of stuff to kick in, your liver glycogen has to get depleted and body has to be a little bit worse at producing ketones and all that kind of stuff. And we see all of that kind of enhanced in people that are heavier. And so it takes, when heavier individuals fast, it takes longer for them before they get into a depleted state than somebody who is really lean and doesn't have all, because remember, all fat is literally energy storage for when you start fasting. And so if you're dealing with people at higher body fat percentage, they literally have more energy stores for fasting. So they're going to be more tolerant to longer fasts.
So also, I think somebody could hear this and be like, oh, okay, cool. So like, I'm trying to add muscle. So I could do these these days where I maybe have 24 hours because I'm not going to lose muscle. But I'm assuming that obviously if you're trying to build up tissue, this would not be something that you would recommend to that person there if you're trying to maximize muscle growth at that point.
Yeah, I never recommend any kind of fasting protocol to somebody that's trying to build muscle. Usually just only if people are trying to lose fat or maintain muscle while losing fat or try to stay the same.
Yeah.
Because I've never seen somebody that goes, I want to pack on as much muscle as possible. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to stop eating. Sounds like a really good idea. And so because of that, yeah, if you're trying to bulk, it's the time for it. You got your dreamer bulk on because it's December. Don't worry about fasting. Don't fast.
What would be for somebody that is trying to maximize muscle growth, say they're in a small surplus, what would be like the smallest amount you would do from a time restricted like feeding aspect? And then would there be things within that you would like pay attention to?
So if someone does, that is actually one interesting study that I've thought about like down the line trying to pull off is what would happen if we actually do want people to try to gain weight in these settings. Because so far people have mostly just tried to either get people to lose weight or get people to stay at the same weight, and really saw people like try to gain muscle mass or something like that. But I would go with the most kind of conservative protocol possible, which the most conservative one we have in the literature right now is about a 14-hour fasting window. So again, that'd be like eat from 10 a.m. to 8 p.m.
Okay.
And the biggest thing, again, I would still try to say is try to get probably 3 to 4 good protein feedings, still making sure probably 1.6 to 2 grams per kg of protein per day. But the biggest thing that I always try to harp on when people are trying to do this with lifting is trying to put the exercise within the feeding window so that you can still maintain good peri-workout nutrition guidelines, still making sure you're met, because the main thing that's going to really determine whether or not the person builds muscle or maintains muscle when they're fasting or anything like that is how well that workout is.
Yeah.
How, like, we can have the most perfect nutrition setup, hitting your macros perfectly, all this kind of stuff. If your workout sucks, like, you're not going to get as good of results. And so doing whatever you can to try to maintain performance within that workout as much as possible. So again, and that's another caveat when you look at all the literature right now so far, especially the long term. So putting people through 8, 12, 16-week protocols, the workout is always during the feeding window. So right now, unfortunately, we don't have any long-term data on what would happen if we have people train during the fasting window versus the feeding window. But my main recommendations would be, if you really want to fast, okay, I would just go with a really conservative protocol, because that's going to make it the easiest possible to get the calories in that you need to get in. It's also going to allow you to space out your meals the best, and then just do whatever you can to try to maintain good peri-workout nutrition, and then just whatever you can try to protect performance within the workout the best.
Yeah, that makes sense, because like we talked about with the carbohydrates before a workout, if that's going to impact your training, it's, again, maybe in the short term, it's not a big deal, but what does that look like long term? I'm sure you're leaving some on the table at some point there. So it sounds like, again, like I totally agree with you. If you're trying to be in a surplus, like I don't understand really any reason why you'd want to try to do any sort of fasting anyways. But it sounds like probably one of the main concerns is, yes, obviously you want to hit that protein at least a couple times a day there with that, but probably just getting in that food that you would need to get in that window is what really ends up being the main issue, probably more than just like there being any downside to not eating for an extended period of time. It's just getting all that food in that period of time would probably be the biggest challenge for most people there.
Exactly. Because like I was saying, biggest thing we see when people start fasting is they just eat less calories throughout the day because they're eating less often and they get full. And so they end up cutting more calories out. And when people are bulking, you need to get more calories in. So that's why fasting, you're doing something with fasting that makes it harder to get more calories in. So you're like going against yourself. I guess the only kind of situation I could potentially see where it might be beneficial is, let's say you're dealing with somebody that is trying to gain weight, trying to get calories in, but they're somebody that can eat a lot already, and you only want to keep them in a slight surplus. But if you let them go, they're going to put themselves in 1,000-calorie surplus. But by doing this, you may be able to keep them in that like 100, 200 calorie surplus, something like that. And it's just going to make it a little bit easier for them that way. Like that's a potential, maybe if I had to think of an out there situation that this might be beneficial for, that would be the closest that I could think of. Like somebody that you are essentially, even when you're trying to gain weight, you're having to pull back like how many calories they're eating, because otherwise they just gain weight too quickly.
Again, it comes back to, hey, how can we get you to stick to the energy balance that we want you to be in? What's the best strategy there for that? And again, obviously we have general recommendations here, but there's always going to be that like outlier of, hey, this actually might work a little bit better for you potentially. So you mentioned obviously exercising during your feeding window. I'm pretty sure when we were specifically just talking about that, we were saying, hey, for gaining muscle. Now, let's take it from a fat loss. You're just trying to maintain muscle. I know you said in these studies, they are still exercising in the window. Is that something that you would still recommend for those people as well, too, even if they're trying to drop body fat while maintaining their lean body mass?
I would still, because that gives you the best chance to hit all your peri-workout nutrition timing, even though we know that nutrient timing comes secondary to just how much you get in throughout the day. Like, for instance, it doesn't matter if you're hitting your post-workout shake if you're still like 100 grams of protein less a day than you need. But the one thing I worry about when working during people are working out during the fasting window is, yes, we have data showing there might be some slight increase, depending on the type of exercise you're doing, there might be some slight increases in fat oxidation and stuff like that. But a lot of times that comes with a trade-off of either the workout feels a lot harder to get the same amount of work done, or the person doesn't get as much work done. And so you're impacting training quality and training quantity and quality sometimes, and you're at a greater risk for that if you're working out fasted. And so that's going to make it harder to hold on to that muscle that you work so hard to earn. Now, in practicality reasons, I would much rather somebody work out fasted than not work out at all. But if we're saying like the ideal situation, how you're going to set up your day, all that kind of stuff, I would ideally have somebody put it still within the feeding window.
And most people, let's be honest, like they can say they're not worried about lean body mass or whatnot, but it's like that stuff's important to them, because it's like you could drop weight, but it's if you're dropping lean body mass, or again, you're not maintaining as much as you could, it's like that's going to show up and you're not going to be happy with that. So it's like you might as well, this would be something that, like you said, it's like, hey, yes, we just want you to work out, but it's, hey, if you're really going to put the time into this, that's probably not too big of an issue for you to make that work there, to get some food in during that period of time. What about age? How does this impact it? Does that change your mind on any of it in terms of somebody's age when it comes to timing? Or is it same thing? Hey, whether you're 50, 30, okay, I still think it's super important. Or do you think it's maybe even more important for people as they age from like a body composition standpoint to make sure that they're getting some food in their workout around when they work out?
I'd say I would lean towards it's more important to the older the person gets, because we have this phenomenon that happens with older individuals called anabolic resistance, which is basically the anabolic stimuli that people get from lifting and eating protein. Older individuals don't see as big of a rise in those anabolic processes as younger individuals do from the same amount. So you eating the same amount of protein or doing the same workout, we don't see protein synthesis rise as much in older individuals as we do in younger individuals. So the margin for error, I would argue, is a lot smaller in older individuals than younger individuals. You can get away with a lot less. You can screw up a lot more and still get very similar results, versus older individuals, you have to, that's when I'm going to be worried more about, okay, let's really try to like make sure you're getting enough protein in, not only throughout the day, but especially per sitting. And then let's try to maximize your workout as much as possible because you're already fighting an uphill battle. So it's essentially like when you're working with older individuals, it's pretty much like you're working with younger individuals that are in a heavy calorie deficit, even when they're not in even when that older individual isn't in a calorie deficit.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And then what about like sex differences? Would that go into consideration as well too for you?
I haven't seen as much data to suggest that there would be as big of an issue with sex differences. I would be more, instead of as body composition, I'd be a little bit more worried about bone health, especially in older female populations. And so really trying to make sure that they're lifting as well as they can just to help, because they're at a much higher risk for osteopenia, osteoporosis, and stuff like that. But I think the much bigger factor is going to be just age in general. So probably like age is the main thing I would worry about. And then very slightly after that, I'd worry about sex a little bit. But again, like most of the data we have is that we're not going to change our training too much for males versus females. It's more just, worrying about the age first, I'd say.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Cool. Is there anything over the last 2.5 years from either, again, fat loss, muscle, or performance that you've changed your mind on when it comes to intermittent fasting? Has there been any research that's come out that's, oh, hey, I thought this way and I'm changing my mind on that a little bit?
That's a really good question.
And just to help you, has there been any research? Go ahead. Did you think of something? You got a smile on your face.
No, I was laughing because the jumping in as I was being a very bad podcaster with all the silence.
No, hey, it's fine. I think it's always good to test the silence to see how long you can make it last, because I mean, it is uncomfortable. So it's always good to just see, okay, how long can we sit here with this before somebody says something? But yeah, did you come up with anything, or I can come up? I have some follow-ups to that. If you couldn't think of anything, that's fine.
Yeah, let's see if one of the follow-ups jogs my memory here. I'm sure there are. It's just not the first thing popping in my mind at the moment.
Yeah, that pretty much tells me that there hasn't been anything like big that's come out from like an intermittent fasting standpoint. So it sounds like the consensus on everything is still relatively the same as what you would have said 2.5 years ago in terms of your kind of general consensus on intermittent fasting for, again, fat loss, muscle gain, and whatnot there.
Yeah, I'd say I haven't seen any big evidence that still really changed my mind that the number one thing here is just how many calories you're eating. And then if people are eating the same amount of calories, same amount of protein, then we should see the same amount of fat loss, changes in body composition, changes in performance, that type of thing. And it's mostly just because, again, pretty much almost most of the studies I've seen, especially around exercise coming out, it's still the same general trends that I always see. I was going through it again the past couple of days because I know we were going to jump on here and to see if I really missed something. And again, pretty much every single time saw something like a study pop up showing F did this a lot better or something like that. Again, go look at the calorie data. And again, it's, these people lost more fat because they were eating less calories. And so just time and time again, we see that it is really nice how often we're still seeing really good maintenance of either performance or maintenance of muscle mass, even though people are having these decreased meal frequencies, so eating less, longer fasts. And so we're getting more and more data to show we can safely do this and have people be successful as long as they're exercising, as long as they're still eating a good amount of protein, it's well tolerated, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
What about like time of day? I know there was I think it was the big breakfast study, maybe that might not be the right one, but has your thoughts on that kind of altered at all in terms of what time of day you would recommend somebody to do this? Or does it just come down to, hey, whatever you can stick with? That to me, that's the most important thing.
Yeah, the be all end all for me always when working with people is what can someone stick to? Because the number one factor in whether or not someone's going to have success is not whether they're doing something that the literature supports, it's whether or not they're doing something that they can stick to long term.
Yep.
But yeah, I haven't seen as much come out on recently because these studies are getting really hard to do. But there's a different type of time restricted eating so now what most people think of as time restricted eating, some people will call delayed time restricted eating.
Yep.
And then there's early time restricted eating, which is basically doing the same either 6 or 8 hour food window, but eating all your food in the morning. Now, when you look at those studies, there are some really interesting findings with them. But the potential issue that I see with a lot of them is they're having people finish all their food by 3 p.m. in a couple of the big ones, like the Sutton paper and stuff like that. And in terms of ecological validity, if I'm helping my clients, helping my patients, something like that, how likely is it that long term someone's going to be successful if I say, hey, you can't go home and have dinner with your family every day? So even if it's showing that it's doing all these great things, which there is some really interesting studies on it, the Sutton papers is the main one. The question still goes, what utility does it have for us if people can't follow it for a long period of time? Now, there are some individual, John Hawley's lab, they're trying to further some work on the early time restricted eating, and they'll argue for more of like a 10 to 6 or something instead of a 12 to 8. But then so much when we're pushing that back, it's okay, now we're just basically quibbling again over what's early versus delayed. If it's, oh, you just eat 10 to 6 instead of noon to 8. Like when we look at circadian rhythm and circadian patterns, that's so small of a difference that I would argue that we can't really say that's a truly different form of fasting. Again, that's for us like scientists to like try to make careers arguing about minute details about, but when it comes to the actual practitioner, 9 times out of 10, I'm pretty much always going to say, find one that sticks with you, find the window that sticks with you. And one of the other things that I've come to believe a little bit more is, again, if we look at the underlying mechanism of just most of the benefits are getting people to eat less, one of the beauties of it is that window doesn't need to be the same every single day. You can, if you want to stick to that 8-hour window, let's say normally yours is noon to 8 p.m. because that's the most common. You've got your kid has a birthday party that you have to go to on Saturday, that they're going to be there at 10 o'clock. There's going to be a bunch of food and it's going to be really awkward if you don't eat with everyone else there. Cool. So let's just on Saturday, let's just move your 8-hour window up a little bit. And so let's go 10 to 6 on that Saturday. And then you can still live your normal life, do all that kind of good stuff, and still stay within your constraints. There's nothing that absolutely says it needs to be the same 8-hour window 7 days a week. And one of the reasons I like intermittent fasting so much is because I think it's one of the few that has enough flexibility that people can still live a lot of their normal life. I'm not asking people to cut out entire food groups and completely change their eating habits, or instead of eating this food, you have to eat all this food. You have to stop eating all your favorite foods. It's okay, let's just try to eat less of them and and we'll trick you into eating less by staying within this window. And then let's just move that window to where it like best fits you. And then that's going to help people stick to it long term, which overall for most people is going to end up with better results and healthier lives. And that's what we're here for.
What do you say to people that are like, oh, hey, I'm going to start intermittent fasting for the health benefits? Somebody will be like, oh, hey, I want to get like autophagy going, stuff like that. What do you typically say to things like that?
So autophagy is a fun one because actually that is one of my like things with fasting is when people talk about autophagy, because in a review that I published a couple of years ago, I made sure to put in a autophagy section because of how often you see that. And we have a lot of data that fasting can increase in autophagy, but all the data showing that it increases autophagy is in mice models, like animal models. And they have much faster metabolisms than us. So the same kind of 16, 20-hour fast for them, which is what those studies were using, now unfortunately I haven't found like a great direct like conversion rate, but just talking to a bunch of animal researchers that I know, I'll say something like that is probably equivalent to closer to a 30-hour fast for us. So there's only there's about 3 studies, human studies, trying to look at just not even truly intermittent fasting, but do we really see autophagy increase during fasting in humans? And the data is very mixed. Some of it has shown yes, but only in people that are really untrained. And so once people become really well trained, we don't see the rise in autophagy in like normal fasting. Some of them shows like we have some markers of autophagy that kind of go up, but the other ones that should go up don't. So we really don't know what's going on. So especially with autophagy, like autophagy is great, but also keep in mind when you're increasing autophagy, you're down regulating protein synthesis. So the only time autophagy is high is when you're not building a lot of protein. And so if we're trying to maintain muscle, you want to be building a lot of protein. And so your body is really good at making sure all this stuff happens in sync, how it should. Yes, you can do it for a bunch of health benefits, but we don't really have any good data to actually suggest in most intermittent fasting protocols that we would actually see a rise in autophagy leading to some of these things. No matter how much, if you look at pretty much any review on intermittent fasting, autophagy is going to get mentioned somewhere. And so that's one of the reasons that I jump, especially since a bunch of my friends are like really heavy autophagy researchers and stuff like that. And I really wanted to actually look at some of that from within my dissertation as well, but that costs a lot of money.
A lot of money.
Because in order to do all that biochem, it ain't cheap. And then you got to find people that'll let you do biopsies and take chunks of their leg, and it becomes this whole thing. And I wanted to graduate eventually, but when it comes to health benefits, again, yes, we have some studies showing that in ISO, so when people eat the same amount of calories and they didn't lose weight, a few studies showed some improvements in some like glucose, cholesterol, blood pressure, stuff like that, which can be great. But again, those are in people that are already dysregulated. So pre-diabetics, people with hypertension, that kind of thing. So if you're already somebody that has normal blood sugar, has normal cholesterol, has normal blood pressure, a question how much fasting would actually increase it. So you're going to go from healthy to healthier. I don't really know. And you're going to get more benefit out of just the caloric restriction aspect of it, of just losing weight. That's what's going to drive the vast majority of the improvements in health, as opposed to the active fasting in general. But if fasting is the thing that helps you get there, that's awesome. Like, for instance, like I don't always intermittent fast, but I like it. I like using it, whenever I'm traveling or something, because then, or anytime, I should say, like anytime, like I want to not be going overboard, but I don't want to worry about counting calories or anything too much, then I like using it because it's going to help me keep my calories in check. And so a lot of times that's what I'm going to travel or speak at conferences or something like that. It helps me keep my calories in check so I don't become the Vin Diesel meme of 12 weeks of dieting, 1 weekend off, that type of thing. But for some people, it's what helps them year round. And you talk to some people and they absolutely hate it. Like I can tell you, like a couple of the studies I've done, they said they didn't mind the eating less. What they actually hated was just being at the office and people bagels there and having to wait until noon to eat or 1 to eat or whatever it was. And for those people, I wouldn't recommend it. And we can still get you the same health benefits by doing something else. For those people, do something else. For people that love fasting, you can go ahead and fast.
Yeah, no, I think you summed up all this great. And it's crazy because I feel like anytime I like go give a talk somewhere, and it's usually not on social media, people that follow me or they're into fitness, health and fitness and stuff, and they have a general idea about intermittent fasting. But when I go and give these like talks, like to people that maybe don't have as much knowledge as like social media followers do and stuff like that, when I talk nutrition, I swear every single time I like, hey, I got time for questions here. Intermittent fasting gets brought up at least like every single time. Like, oh, what do you think about intermittent fasting? It's crazy. It's crazy how every single time that happens, somebody will bring it up, and it is very popular. And I think maybe in our evidence-based like body composition, maybe we don't hear about it as much because we have a general idea. But it's like outside of that, I feel like people just it's a very popular topic, in terms of like diets and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's everything in the diet industry, it goes in waves. And so there'll be a period where it's not really popular in the future, there'll be another period where it dies out and you don't really hear about that much, but then probably 5 years later, it'll be back and you'll be everywhere. And so right now we're in a period where it's really popular, just like we were in around 2016, 2018-ish. Like it was super, super popular. I think died out again around like 2000. And then now we're hearing it all over again.
So is there anything coming up from like any research that you're aware of that maybe people like certain areas people are looking at, or maybe something that you are interested in terms of, hey, here's where, something might change here? Or do you feel like we've got a pretty good grasp on the intermittent fasting side of things?
Yeah. So going forward, stuff that I'm really interested in is comparing different protocols, because I can only think of 1 or 2 studies where we're actually directly within the same study looking at, okay, if we have people do a 6-hour feeding window versus an 8-hour feeding window. And so that's a route that I really want to go down. And I'm looking at, got a couple applications to like get some grants to hopefully look at that a bit. And then same thing going down the rabbit hole of, okay, how much does training time matter? Again, if we have how many people are training in the morning fasted and then start eating at noon and then they still get all their protein in, how much does that really matter? Those are the 2 rabbit holes that I'm really interested in going down. And that's where I would really like to see us going. The way I like to put it is the ways we can manipulate these protocols to make it easier for people to follow and still reap some of the same benefits. And
yeah. It's funny because I feel like whether I get on Examine or wherever I go, and like it's always, is intermittent fasting better than regular caloric restriction? For it seems like those like studies like continually like just pop up over and over again in terms of that.
Yeah, we have it. That's what I was alluding to, is we're getting a lot of those where it's do a 16 and 8 versus just a normal 25% calorie deficit throughout the day, and eat normally throughout the day. We have a lot of those, but unfortunately we don't have that much of, okay, let's say if you do an 8-hour window versus a 4-hour window versus the 24 hours twice a week, that type of thing. Like how are these actually going to, how are within intermittent fasting, like how are these protocols going to compare to one another? So far, the only one I'm really aware of is the Cienfuegos paper, which is a great paper looking at 6 hours versus 4 hours. But again, that was in people that are not exercising. And I want to see how this is going to affect people that are exercising, not only because that's my field, but also because in order to be the healthiest for people and maintain muscle mass and have all those good things, we want people to exercise during it.
I would also, and I don't know this for sure, but would it be hard to be able to actually make that happen from a study standpoint? Would you have to put them in like a metabolic ward or something like that in order to do that? Or what would be the process for that? Because I feel like that would be hard to be like, oh, hey, go out, don't eat. Because I know obviously with all like nutrition research and stuff like that, you're always like, with them tracking stuff like that, it's always somewhat of a guessing game there with that. But yeah, I'm curious to hear that.
Yeah. So the best way, obviously, the only way to truly know would be, yes, to use a metabolic ward. But unfortunately, most of us don't have millions of dollars to be able to do that.
Yeah.
So yeah, unfortunately, typically the way we have to go about it is, get people, enroll people in, one of them, and then ask them to track. And usually we ask them to also track like the time that they ate and all that kind of stuff. And then you're taking them at their word, which is another really big aspect of when you're reading this literature and you're interpreting it. You have to remember that's a huge limitation of everything we do in this field, is we're taking all these people at their word that they actually did what we asked them to do. And any of us that have worked with clients can tell you that people always are just straight up front you with what they actually did. But if you get enough people in it, you get a large enough sample size, you can hope that when people were off track, usually that kind of washes itself out, or they might end up being an outlier. So if you see somebody, if everybody pretty much lost weight and then you get one person that stayed right there, then that tells you, okay, that person probably didn't follow what we asked them to do. Or if like vice versa, if everyone stays the same, one person like massively decreases, okay, that person maybe did like a little extra, like we told them not to do any extra cardio or something. That person probably started becoming an ultra marathoner just before this or something. But yeah, that's one of the unfortunate realities, is because we don't have people throwing money at us that we would need to really run all of these studies.
I'm sure, especially too, with people that are already like fairly healthy and exercising as well too. There's probably not really, you're definitely not going to get as much money for those types of studies either, I would imagine too.
Yeah, so that's one of the big things. That's one of the reasons so much of our field is people are looking, if you look at the participants, it's either like untrained or this clinical population, the pre-diabetics, elderly. I'm not ragging on, we need data in those populations, but the big reason people are looking at those populations instead of healthy, active individuals that are just trying to get ready for spring break or something like that is because organizations aren't going to give you grants to study those people, to study those populations, because they're like, because we want to study the disease population. So we'll give you money if you want to study the disease populations to run those, because that's helping society as the whole versus us that want to help people get jacked.
As I've had this podcast and I've talked to more researchers, man, I just admire the work that you guys do, because I mean, it is super challenging. And but before you like really ask questions about what goes into this, you just think it's this like perfect thing where it's everyone's going to be perfect. They're going to abide by the rules perfectly. Everything's going to be great. But as you like dive into it, damn, it's just like literally having a bunch of clients trying to get them to do things that, it's not easy.
It's very, I think it's very reminiscent of my couple of years as a trainer and stuff like that. In a lot of times, especially when you run training studies, it's very much, that's I have a lot of undergrads or students that ask me, oh, what can we do this training study on this? I'm like, I'd love to, but you're talking about like 2,000 hours worth of work to put that down. And if you want to do it, we will help you. We'll find a way, but just be ready what you're signing up for. It's not as simple of, hey, let's just get a bunch of people to come in and do this training study for 16 weeks. It's,
yep.
You don't know what you're asking for right now.
Yeah, no, it's crazy, man. I admire everything you guys do. So we're coming up on 15 past the hour. Did you maybe want to briefly touch on the pre-workout study, or did you want to end this here? It's up to you, but if you want to briefly go over it, maybe we can touch on that real quick and then we can end the conversation. Does that work for you? Is that all right?
Yeah, it's perfectly fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah, if you just want to maybe give like a brief overview of it, I just think it's a cool little study to go over and maybe what you guys were trying to look for and things like that in the study.
Yeah, so the main thing we were looking at with that study is, so we did it in conjunction with Legion, who a supplement company, puts out a bunch of products. So they wanted to get their pre-workout, some data behind their pre-workout. So what we looked at was a couple versions of it. So it was the Pulse pre-workout, the regular caffeinated versus the non-caffeinated. You got the Pulse right there?
Got the non-caffeinated one. So I'm curious to hear what the findings were.
Blue Raz, or which one do you go with?
Well, today's my favorite sour candy. I had another one in my pantry. It's like the kiwi. I think the kiwi one maybe. Yeah,
that one's a good one. I'm a sucker for the apple, just because I'm always
apple's good too. Yeah,
I'm just a sucker for anything like sour apple flavored.
Yep.
So as soon as I saw that, I was like, okay, I gotta do that.
I agree.
But so we looked at the caffeinated version of Pulse and the non-caffeinated version of Pulse, and essentially a placebo, which was just like Crystal Light, essentially. Then brought people into the lab, then had them do a couple things. We put them on this basically torture device looking thing that was a squat device. So it's what's called an isokinetic squat device. So isokinetic, essentially that means is no matter how hard you try, the speed of which you do the rep is going to stay the same. So people had to do a 4-second eccentric, 1 second pause at the bottom, 4-centric. So 4 seconds on the way down, 1 second pause at the bottom, 4 seconds on the way up, 1 second pause at the top, and then do 3 reps of that, 2 sets of 3 reps of that, basically trying to resist the way on the way down as hard as they could, or push up into it on the way up as hard as they could. And that's when you look at the day when they're talking about like isokinetic force, that's what they're talking about. Or we set up midway in the squat and then had them basically try to stand up into it and finish the squat as hard as they possibly could. And that's what they were talking about with the isometric force when you look at the paper. And then after that, we took them down to the weight room and then tested tried to answer the age-old question of how much you bench. And then the less age-old question of how much you leg press. And then after we found out how much they benched and how much they leg pressed, then we put a percentage of their body weight on the bar and just saw how many reps they could do. And so that's the repetitions to failure thing on there. So did the isometric squat, then the isokinetic squat, then how much you bench, then rep out on the bench, then how much can you leg press, then rep out on the leg press. And then ask them a bunch of questions throughout it, basically how you feel, does it give you any energy, do you feel mentally focused, all that kind of stuff. And the big reason that I thought was interesting with this is within especially the pre-workout world, like one of the, we see this growing trend of the non-caffeinated pre-workouts.
Yeah. And
because there's a lot of people that want to work out at night, but don't want to be up till 4 a.m. because you just slammed 300 mgs of caffeine. And up to the point of that paper, there had been a couple studies that had looked at pre-workout versus non-caffeinated pre-workout, but none that were the direct same formula.
Gotcha.
So the same pre-workout, but the caffeinated version and the non-caffeinated version. So we're the first one to look at the actual same formula, caffeinated versus non-caffeinated. Now we saw that, so for isometric force, so when we put them at a mid squat, so halfway in the squat, and they had to stand up in the device and try to finish the squat as hard as they could, even though the device wasn't going to move, that was increased in both the caffeinated and non-caffeinated versions of the pre-workout, but over the placebo. But then we got to the actual benching and leg press and stuff, there wasn't any differences there, except for one kind of actually really interesting difference was males in the non-caffeinated group. The non-caffeinated pre-workout actually got less reps on the leg press than any of the other conditions, even placebo. But our guess for that is how, so there are a couple options. One, that could have just been a completely random thing. That's something that always with research, there's always the option that what we saw could have happened completely randomly. But also one of the ways that especially caffeine and stuff like that really helps you is we find that it's not actually, say, allowing you to put more pounds on the bar, but allow set quality to stay for set 2, set 3, set 4, and so on. They're going to stay closer to set 1. And without the caffeine in there, one of the things we were thinking is potentially because the isometric force production was higher still, the dudes potentially might have, blown their wads too much on the squat and then got to leg press. And since that leg press rep out was the very last thing we did of the day, after bench press, they were just essentially tired. So the pre-workout increased performance at the beginning, and they just tired themselves out. And so by the time we got to the very last thing of the day, for that particular instance, they got a few less reps. That was the thought there.
And for the non-caffeinated, that was not an issue. You didn't see that happen.
So that was in the non-caffeinated.
That was in the non-caffeinated that happened. Got you.
So
okay.
So the caffeinated. So that was the interesting part. Caffeinated and placebo had the same results in that instance. And the non-caffeinated pre-workout is when we saw the decrease in leg press.
Interesting.
So that's why when we saw that, we were trying to sit there going, what? But then so that was our prevailing theory of where we saw that particular condition increase performance earlier in the workout. So it's potentially like the trade-off of the increasing performance earlier in the workout is they just tired themselves out earlier in the workout. And when they got to the end, where normally caffeine would be kicking in and helping them finish that out. And with rep outs, we can all tell like the mental aspect of it that goes into it. Yeah. And another thing to consider with this is in order to be in the study, everyone had to be habitual caffeine consumers. So they all had to normally take in at least 250 milligrams a day. And we did all of this in the morning. So I'm having people come into the lab after not having caffeine for at least 12 hours. They're used to having caffeine, then not allowing them to have caffeine and putting them through a workout.
Yeah.
At the very end of the workout, they're likely going to be tired.
I love my coffee and I have it every morning. So if I didn't have that and I got put in the non-caffeinated or the placebo, same thing would probably happen to myself as well too at that point.
Yeah, so that's one of the things that's up with interpreting the study, because the reason that we did it all in the morning like that is so that we could control pre-exercise food. So we had them come in, we gave them a standardized breakfast, we gave a little bit of time for the breakfast to digest, then we gave them the pre-workout, then we waited about 30 minutes before we started the exercise session after that. So for these people that were in the non-caffeinated trial or the placebo, it could be 10:30, 11 o'clock before they maybe have had caffeine and they're used to having it like right when they get up. So that's going to definitely play a role. But like I was talking about with fasting a bunch, I don't look at this paper again showing that, pre-workouts do nothing, so you should throw out your pre-workout and don't ever take it. The way I look at this is you shouldn't feel obligated to take a pre-workout. If you shouldn't, for those people that I hear from all the time that like, I just don't like taking them, doesn't make me feel that great. And so I just don't want to do it. I want to drink coffee instead, which in the back of my mind is going, okay, so coffee is your pre-workout.
Right.
But still, I just want to drink coffee. Okay, cool. So what this says is you can just do the coffee thing and it's fine. You're not going to really be missing out on much. But if you want to take pre-workout, you can take pre-workout and still be fine. Because when we did see that increase in isometric force production, but the one question with that is how often are people doing isometrics in the gym? But I know so many people that the act of taking a pre-workout isn't necessarily actually for performance increases. It's more of the ritualistic aspect of I've taken my pre-workout. Now, psychologically, I know I got to go get in the gym. And so if they wouldn't have taken that pre-workout, they wouldn't have gone and trained. Or when they feel the beta alanine start kicking in, they go, okay, that's the signal behaviorally. That's the signal that for me it's time to go train now. It's still getting them in the gym and they're still getting benefits of taking it. If you want to take it, great. If you don't want to take it, fine. The other aspect I would say with interpreting this is, again, I alluded to this, I think, towards the beginning of our talk was, think about the exercise protocol that we did. How much you bench, a rep out. How much you leg press, a rep out. Like essentially a single set of each. Like how reflective of that is how someone's actually going to train. And so a lot of the ones that did really show a benefit, previous studies that have shown a benefit, it's with multiple sets and stuff like that. And so since we're doing single sets like this, shows, okay, maybe for the first set, it might not make a difference. But what about if we did 5 sets of each exercise? Then maybe. And so that's some follow-up work that I'd really like to do, because I am really interested in this class of non-caffeinated pre-workouts. Because again, we need something out there for people that want to work out later in the day, but don't want to be up till 2 a.m.
In my case, the reason I do the stem free is I have enough coffee, right? So I don't want to also add on another 200-300 milligrams of caffeine. And like you said, that a habitual thing, it really is, man. Like it is such a thing. And for me too, it's also a great way to get hydrated before my lift as well too, versus like after sipping on coffee for hours on end too. There's that. And also what you finished up there with, hey, this is just in one set of each thing. This isn't multiple sets. You pinned it to it that like with caffeine specifically, like where you're going to see its improvements is on multiple sets, and like later on, you're not going to see as big of a drop off. So you have to take that into consideration as well too there on it.
Yeah. And so the reason we set it up that way is because that's the specific variables that Legion was really interested in looking at. So that's why we set that study up the way we did. So that's why for future research, what I would like to do is do similar models, but then again, put people through more normal workouts. And then especially instead of in the morning, maybe do it in the afternoon, evening, when more people are likely going to be taking these like non-caffeinated, and then see how that's going on.
Cool. Yeah, no, awesome. Yeah, I thought that was an interesting study. So just want to hear your thoughts on it. Anything else on that study before I let you go?
The way I'd sum up all of it is the immortal words of social media: you do you.
You do you. I love it. You do you. Yeah. Once again, once you had that kind of long pause, I'm like, nope, nothing else he wants to add to that at that point. Cool, man. Hey, appreciate your time. A ton of great information here as always. We'll have to cut down the time in between next time around. Before I let you go though, anywhere where you want to lead the audience to or anything like that? I know you're not a huge social media guy.
Yeah, I do technically have a Twitter, or an X, as I guess we now have to say, but it is essentially just my reading list. So if I see papers that sound interesting, I just retweet it. So that essentially when I have a minute, I go back to that list and start pulling papers to read. I technically do have an Instagram, which you can find me out. I check it about once every 6 months. So if you send me a message or request a follow or something like that, and I haven't accepted it for a while, it's not because I hate you, or I'm ignoring you. It's just because I haven't checked it. I usually, after something like this comes out, I usually go check it a little bit. But then if it's been a while, that's why. So don't get mad at me. Other than that, if you want to follow me, I'm a professor of exercise physiology at University of South Alabama. So you can always get in contact with me there, which best contact is just going to be my name. So Matthew Stratton at southalabama.edu. And yeah, that's probably the best way.
Awesome. Cool. Yeah. Again, we appreciate your time, Matt. We'll have to get you back on again, and yep, we'll talk to you soon.
Sounds great.